Hello, everybody. Grant Hunter here with another Product Growth Leaders topic of the week. This week, we're going to be talking about fatal assumptions of product managers. And for me, as I look at product management, it's almost fully based on assumptions. So when I've read the book Never Assume by John Fontenot, I thought, wow, what a great book. I recommend it to everybody. But I reached out to John a week or so ago and said, hey, why don't we make a topic of the week about fatal assumptions of product managers? So, John, welcome to Topic of the Week. Before we get started, I'd love to get your take on where this come from for you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And thanks for having me, Grant. It's great to be here. So I'd say like my first product management experience, I had this pressure and this misperception about my role that I had to have all the answers and I had to be right. And I'd get really embarrassed when I'd get into to sessions with my dev lead and my UX partner, and they started poking holes and everything. And I'm like, oh man, I suck at this job. And so over time, I started realizing that a lot of the mistakes that I made and a lot of the delays that we had in product launches or the failed product launches were all based on assumptions I had made in various areas. And I started looking around and I didn't see any like holistic, I guess, writing on key assumptions that make products fail. And there's stuff talked about here and there, but I wanted to do something that was hopefully a little more comprehensive, and did some research, talked to a lot of folks, and then Never Assume came out of it.
Awesome. I love the book, and here's Paul's already called me on it. I actually wrote a testimonial for the book. I got a chance to read it in its Google Docs format. But today we got an incredible panel with us today to talk about fatal assumptions of product management. Faith Peterson, Wong, Jason Vincelette, Steve Johnson, Paul Hatala, Cory Bryan, Brian Weber, Nils, and John Fontenot. And so why don't we get started with our Monday question? On Monday, we put this question into the community. What is the biggest fatal assumption product managers make? And John, you were the first one to answer, which Jason, come on, man. Jason normally is my first person. But John, you came with assuming they don't need to test their assumptions. Assuming they don't need to test their assumptions. I think I copied it twice. I do that sometimes. So the biggest assumption is that the biggest fatal assumption is not knowing you should test it.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of hubris, maybe a little bit of confirmation bias. There's something self-conscious about us where we have this overconfidence about our decisions, and we feel so good, whether it's we have so much experience in an area that we feel like we can go off of our gut and we don't have to test the assumptions, or we have enough data to where we don't have to test the assumptions. And whether it's quantitative or qualitative, like there needs to be like a reinforcing loop that I think we often get lazy on and don't actually go back and get the other side of the equation to make sure that we're de-risking our launches like we should. So
it's not just about assumptions, it's about testing those assumptions, proving them or invalidating them.
Correct. Yep.
Awesome. Scientific method that works. So this is a product management science.
I'd like to say that, right? There's an ongoing debate about, is it more art or science? Most people say both, but I think there's a lot of the scientific method baked into it when it's done well.
Awesome. Jason Vincelette, I make fun of you, but if it weren't for John Fontenot, who knew what question was coming, you would have been the first person to answer.
And you guys are definitely coordinated on that one.
It was an attack, Jason. I agree. Jason, you said that they fully understand the market problems without ever talking to the market, and I feel like you're a broken record on this.
What?
Market problems.
What? Yeah, so maybe because that's what I struggle with the most. Managing dev teams, backlogs, getting releases done, talking to executives, like that's not a problem, internal stakeholders and things. For me, it's ensuring, and this has to do with what John's saying too, is understanding the market and like validating your assumptions again with the market and really engaging with your external stakeholders and such versus just everything that's problematic for product managers internal. So that's why I harp on it.
I was actually talking to some executives at a leadership council with our partner Outsell this week, and one of them came up and goes, I keep forgetting how externally focused we need to be with product management. And I think sometimes we do get pulled into that. We're going, Paul Hatala, you actually responded, or they're talking to the market and assuming that they have listened completely.
Yeah, my first thought when I saw this was the comment a smart guy made that not selling anything isn't the worst thing you could do. Selling one of them and having to support it is probably the worst of it. And
who said that, Paul? It sounds familiar.
Some sage. But there was the first thing that came to my mind were the things that needed to have a bunch of band-aids applied to them, or third-party accessories attached to them in order to make them even limp along through the market. And now you've got 2-3 layers of trying to support something that people kind of want. So being partially right in a lot of ways is as bad as being wrong.
I love that, and I was gonna use that as a kick over to that sage. Steve, is that one of the biggest assumptions that, I mean, that's maybe one of the fatal things that happens when you make those assumptions? You're on mute, Steve.
I think that's a fatal outcome. Particularly when your research is comprised of, I talked to a guy, and then we bring it to market and find out that we were wrong. But I think the fatal assumption that many product managers make, and I think there are a number of them, but the one I'll call out is, I think still a lot of product managers make decisions as if they were the customer. In the absence of a definition of who the customer is, the persona, we assume it's ourselves or our parents. And I think product managers are as guilty of that as developers and marketing people.
I totally agree with that. I've seen myself do it. Brian, you're sort of along that line, that the assumption that I know what the customer wants. Talk to me more about that.
Yeah, you talk to 1 or 2 customers and assume that reflects all customers, and you don't test it further. So you assume, yeah, I know what they want. I've talked to a couple people. Or for Steve, I've talked to my sales guy. I know what the customer wants.
Yeah. And so a lot of this is coming. So a lot of this has been focused on our assumptions of our knowledge of the market. Cory, you came a little different. You actually had a list. Biggest that you or others are not assuming something. Other favorites include anybody cares, that you're right, and that you can't know something. Talk to me about it.
Yeah, there's so many times where you end up in the position of what am I assuming, or what are others assuming about this situation or this problem or this issue that we're discussing. There's so many baked in assumptions that we're making that they compound on each other. But I love the idea of testing them that John said, to go through that. I just think even if I'm assuming a positive thing or a negative thing, I would want to say, I think this is true, but let's see if it is.
No, I completely and totally get that. I'm going to throw this to the crowd, although John, definitely what's the difference between an assumption and a hypothesis? Are they basically, is an assumption less data in it? Thoughts?
Testing.
Well, but you test a hypothesis, but you test an assumption.
Assumption, it's already in your head. You've kind of concluded it. The only thing that makes it a hypothesis is when you are purposely making a statement and then saying, now let me see if this is wrong.
Okay, so the assumption turns into a hypothesis, which turns into something you can test. Okay, I can take that.
In this context, an assumption kind of is an axiom of belief, right? It's like if you think about doing an example, you start by saying, well, assume this situation. Yep. And that's what this type of assumption is. We're assuming the situation where we understand the market problem, or whatever our understanding might be. So it's like it's an untested hypothesis or a priori given. And so that's why it's dangerous, because we don't really know it. We don't really know that that's true.
Yeah. John, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a little nuance, I'd say. So a hypothesis in the scientific method is based on an observation, or at least it should be. It can't be just something you pull out of thin air, because that's not a true hypothesis. Where an assumption, you might have to make an assumption based on nothing other than a finger in the wind. And I'll give an example. Something I'm working on right now in my day-to-day is a partnership integration. And we've done some desirability testing to see, does the market actually want this? Would they actually do this if we gave them the option to? And a certain percentage responded positively. And so we said, okay, so we know that this percent of the market, statistically significant, would at least do this if they got the desired outcome that we value prop to them. But we have to account for some level of attrition in that flow. So if we brought this up, not 100% of that percentage is going to actually finish and go through with it. So what percentage actually would go through with it is purely an assumption that we're making that we would have to test once it actually launches.
Okay, I like this conversation. Faith, I'm going to pivot to you. I liked what you put in. It's so self-evident that it seems beyond validation or testing is what an assumption is in your mind.
Well, I think that it seems like we're actually talking about a couple different kinds of assumptions. So I think one is that that's sort of those unspoken assumptions, things that, we just don't maybe even realize that we're thinking them. But I think there's a different thing that is particularly in product development, I think we talk about a lot, which is I don't have better information. I only have the information I have. So absent something more concrete or more informative, I'm going to just have to make an educated guess based on the information that I do have. And I think that's kind of a different category of assumption that is maybe further on that spectrum, closer to a testable hypothesis. But we have to make some assumptions in order to move forward, because we're often not going to have perfect information.
And I used to, you take educated guess, and that's a term Drucker uses a lot. And I used to call them, and I've talked about this before, a WAG, which is a wild ass guess, which is maybe what an assumption is, and a SWAG, which is a scientific wild ass guess, which has a little more data behind it. So I love getting to it. I'm going to get back to the original question, give some of you who did not answer the original question a chance to bring yours in. May Wong, welcome back from your vacation. We're glad to have you back.
Thank you. I don't really I think that the biggest fatal assumption is that even though you are making assumptions, you assume that they're true. Like I think it's safe to make some assumptions because there is a cost to knowing. But if you know what you are assuming, as long as those assumptions aren't pivotal decision points, I think they might be okay, because like in product management, it's all about, managing the risk of what you're going to do. So if you are aware that you don't know everything about this specific thing and you're going forward with it anyways because you have better data elsewhere or other supporting data to support your decision, I think it might be a good thing. When it comes to a hypothesis, like when you talk about like sort of the scientific method and testing out your theories, it's not just theories. Most of it is backed by some theoretical context that might work in your favor when you go and test and then observe. So I think it does make sense for us to make some assumptions, because the reality is you'll never know everything. So identify what your assumptions are and know what you don't know.
I love that. And you made me think about, well, I didn't put it in there, I should have. The biggest fatal assumption product managers make for me is not actually making the assumption. It's not changing things after the assumption has been proved wrong. Mm-hmm. Right? And too often I see people make a decision strategically, tactically based on an assumption. They take something to market and it's proven wrong, but the momentum just has them going and they don't do anything about it. So to me, that's one place that goes for me. Glenn Pride, biggest fatal assumptions product managers make.
Sunk costs. There are times you have to walk away and you may have put a lot of stuff into it.
Yeah.
But if it ain't there, it ain't there.
It's sort of corollary to what I was saying, right? You've made some decisions. Be willing to. I've seen it recently with people talking about Intel back in the day, but Peter Drucker did it too. Like, if we weren't in this business already, would we get into it? And maybe that's, that's a sunk cost type thing, but also I think goes to some of the stuff I'm talking about. Nils.
Yeah. So, John and I talked, and I listened to him on a couple podcasts talk about the assumptions in the book that you want to avoid. And
so you're a ringer. You've
well,
already done this.
Well, I thought of one that wasn't in the book because I felt like, well, I didn't want to just repeat what John said, and it's related to one of the categories that you put into the quiz, assumptions about the organization's abilities. But it's really assuming that sales and marketing know how to sell your product. Now, you may have created a product that solves a problem for a particular segment, and it does it in a differentiated way. But if you don't give sales and marketing that information, at least if you just throw it over the wall, then they're going to sell something else. They're going to make up what to sell, and they're going to fail, or they're going to sell something. They're going to be successful selling something, but it's not the thing that you made. And so then you have to change the thing you made to match what they sold. And that can be a big disaster, as we all know. I've been in companies that did that, which is very unfortunate. Those companies don't exist anymore because of that. So that's one thing that I thought is I'm believing that simply making the solution and this is with having a problem that is validated and we're solving and we made a good solution to it, but just simply throwing it over into sales and marketing, that's going to fail. You have to do more.
Our longtime friend and sometimes participant panelist in this, Jason Weber, said that exact same thing. Assuming that your team can sell what you're doing, or you can take it to market and you can do that. Mm-hmm. Faith Peterson, you talked a little bit about hypothesis versus assumptions, but I'd love to get your take on the biggest fatal assumption you see product managers making.
For me, this one was pretty simple and probably colored by my current situation. But in terms of obstacles to either my own success, kind of as an individual filling the role of product manager, or the success of our product, the products that I'm managing, the biggest fatal assumption is assuming that other people actually want product management to happen or want the products managed. So I'm just gonna leave that there.
So I like that a lot, and I'm actually gonna sort of take that and run with it. Probably the biggest fatal mistake I made was assuming I can change the company, right? I can be the one for a company that has shown that they don't care about product management or it being a strategic role or being market focused. I made the assumption that I have literally run through brick walls, stop signs. I had somebody, I got a job as an executive head of product, smaller company, but one of the people one of my direct reports, I had coached her nephew's baseball team. And so I got introduced to her from the mom, and she's like, "Do you really want to come here?" I'm like, then I talked to somebody about the president, and they're like, "Oh, I worked with him 10 years ago. Do you really want to work for him?" And,
wow.
So my fatal assumption was I thought I was all the difference that was needed. I thought I could be the person to make everything change. And boy, was I wrong with that.
Yeah, that reminds me of the old song about marriage. I'll probably screw it up, but men marry women thinking they'll never change, and they do. And women marry men thinking they can change them, and they never do.
Yeah. And
I think we join companies many times saying, yes, but we can change them. Yeah, we never do. I wanted to add on one thing to an earlier comment, and that was another big assumption is that we assume that build is what product management is about. Mm-hmm. We put so much of our energy into what we're going to build, but wait, we also have to think about who's going to sell it. And if for instance, we're building a product that has a different buyer persona, guess what? You probably need a new sales force because the old sales force will continue selling it to the old buyer persona. But I think in many cases, product managers make a fatal assumption that the channel we have is the channel we have. And besides, I don't deal with the channel anyway. All I do is fill out Jira tickets.
it's something to think about that though, is that should be a decision. Understanding the channel we have and what they can do should be something we factor into our product strategy, right? Thinking about, are we going into a new market that's going to be a different sales model? I mean, when I was working at a really big B2B information and data company, we eventually clearly said, okay, these are the things we sell through our enterprise sales force. These are the things we sell through our inside sales force. And these are the things we sell online. And you had to understand which channel you were going to use for your product as part of your strategy, as a part of your business plan. I don't know. That's sort of where we were.
Yeah, we talk about sales, but I think support as well. I mean, in the organization I am in, when we're making product management decisions on something where we're strategically trying to do, you have to really have this whole product thinking, like we've spoken before, and say, who are all the stakeholders that are going to have to know and understand and not only sell the product, but also once the product is sold, implement product, support product ongoing. And are they ready for not only knowing the product details, which may be the easy part, but working with those personas that may be now different than the personas that you've been working with before, because you've expanded into, outside of your core. And so it's not just about selling it; it's also about implementing it and supporting it as well. We can't forget about those pieces.
Yeah, completely and totally agree. And Cory, I mean, we're only like just over 20 minutes into this conversation. Are you really giving up on never assuming? You're going to stop assuming?
I don't know how to do that, so I'll have to read John's book. I read a book starting with No recently, which is about negotiation, and one of the things he talks about was never assume and never have expectations for negotiation. And I don't know how anything we do is not a negotiation. So I've never figured out how to do that. So I'd love to, because I might be happier, but I don't know how to do that.
Yes, I get that. But I don't know. There's so many things that we do in product management everyday life which are based on assumptions, right? When do I leave to go somewhere? Oh, the traffic's going to be higher at 5 o'clock. I should leave, right? It's hard to give up assumptions. I don't know. Maybe and I think, John, to the point of your book is understand the ones where we tend to make mistakes so we can do it better, right?
Yeah, I think it's just more taking a proactive approach rather than saying, hey, let's just keep working and let the assumptions bite us in the butt. Let's be proactive and intentional about trying to think through what assumptions are we making. If we were to make this decision, what are we not considering? What are we expecting to be true, but we don't actually have evidence of it being true?
Yeah.
And documenting those so we can create a test plan to further mitigate risk. So fully giving up assumptions or never assuming isn't really, I mean, it's a bit hyperbolic of a title, but it's more of just creating an intentionality around your approach to product management.
I love it. And I think that's something Steve and I totally are, we believe that product management is risk management, and that part of it is how do you do it and where do you go. Any last thoughts on this first part before we go to the poll?
One thing I'll throw out there, just in part to pick on Nils, since I've learned he's a math major. When I was taking my most nerd classes in semiconductor physics, we used to draw these huge equations across the entire chalkboard. And then the professor would look over each shoulder and say, are there any math majors in here? Then he would say, these are all third and fourth order elements in this decision. We can exclude all these things. And it would come down to maybe 2 factors that really drove the behavior of how the material was going to react. And once you realize that you don't need to know everything, you need to know those couple of drivers, and you need to figure out what you need to do about those. It doesn't have to be the answer. It just needs to be directionally true.
Right.
Actually,
I totally agree with that. So that's why I'm not a mathematician. I am a product manager.
The engineer and the math major are agreeing on that. And actually, Paul, you were in the product strategy class we just did. And in understanding the market landscape, or analyzing the market landscape, I was like, there's 2 key things you need to know. Where are you in the life cycle, and where are you in the competitive ladder? And that's going to have an outsized impact on what your strategy is. So I love this idea of understanding what are those 2 or 3 key things that you really do need to know, and maybe shift some assumptions on others, but shift a little more time on those to sort of get a little more data, to be a little more educated, as Faith was saying earlier. All right, we're going to go to the poll. I paused there just in case. Actually, let me make it bigger. So yesterday, because I was out of the office on Wednesday, I put this poll in the community. What type of fatal assumptions do you make the most? And this is a big flip, because normally we talk about the industry as a whole, but this is talking about each of us individually. The options were assumptions of my knowledge of the market, assumptions of my status in the organization, assumptions of what leadership thinks, assumptions about the organization's abilities, and other it depends. Steve, you're standing there all by yourself. 5% assumptions of my status in the organization.
I noticed I was sitting all by myself in that little row. Yeah, you know,
is there something I need to do better? Am I not communicating properly enough? You don't know where you sit in our organization?
Well, I think it's different here, but yeah, I just looking at that poll and reflecting on experiences over the last few years, I think I did think that it turns out, you know, I thought I was hired to drive the product strategy. What a silly assumption that was, right? I mean, I thought that they wanted to be focused on the market and make data-informed decisions. How ridiculous is that? You know, so a lot of the bad behavior of that I've encountered in the past, I just assumed that. Well, I assumed the thing the poll question. You know, I
Your
assumed
status.
that I had a better clarity on my relationship with the other leaders. I thought, you know, here's my big assumption. I just assumed that we were all working for the same company.
Yeah. And actually, if you go back to the story I just told, there's sort of, I could spin it that same way. My assumption was I could make things change. I think I had that I had the status to make things change, and you know, I didn't. Maybe I should reevaluate my stuff. John Fontenot, you actually voted for other, and you said assuming we're aligned across the org is the business. That one actually, your answer came in. I'm like, dang it, I should have had that one as because alignment is such an important thing. Talk to me.
Yeah, I feel like this is the bane of my existence, and I devoted a whole chapter to it. Chapter 7 is twice as long as any other chapter in the book because of this reason. Yeah, I mean, like, it's interesting because I think some of what Steve talked about status bleeds into this in some organizations. It's, do we treat product management as technical project management, where the rest of the organization gives you projects to implement because you're just an executionary piece, or are you really a strategic piece of the business? And even if you are a strategic piece of the business, if you get over the whole thing of like, yes, product needs a seat at the table, then is product doing enough to bring people to the table to make sure that we're aligned? And which kind of goes back to another point we talked about that Nils talked about, of never assuming that sales and marketing know what you're building or could sell what you're building. And so I think all these things kind of coalesce into alignment and making sure that communication is such that the thing that you're building aligns with not only market expectations, but the expectations that your sales and marketing team have of what you're giving them to go to market with.
No, and for me, this was a huge one, because I've got an article I wrote called Product Management is what connects strategy to execution. And we talk about that alignment being necessary. And the better job you do with clarity and alignment and communication, you can actually push decisions downstream. You can become atomic in the decisions. And that alignment enables so much agility, not agile, right? And so I think that's why when I saw your answer, I sort of was a little pissed at myself for not having that. I started looking at all the things you listed, and I didn't want to make it about I can't put 10 in here, so I couldn't do it that way. So I was a little limited by my form factor. So I'm like, let's go to types of decisions, and I probably would have put that in assumptions about the organization's abilities, but it still was so good I probably could have brought it out on its own. So Paul Hatala, you said when you assume that some function of the organization consists of flawless craftspeople, did you put organizational skills? Is that where you voted?
Organization's abilities, yeah. Yeah, and that's a couple of things that were near and dear to my heart. Being in product, I like to still tell stories. I have enough gray hair, and I've lost most of it, where
I was about to say, you do?
I have no doubts about where I sit in an organization or my capabilities, good, bad, or indifferent, mostly bad or indifferent. But when I start to look at other parts of the organization, this week I had an advisor on our technical team tell me that something that's 60-year-old technology, he didn't understand the limitations of it. That boggled my mind a little bit. We're 3 years into the project. But on the flip side, I'm trying to use purposeful ignorance of assumptions with our sales team when they say that, no, we followed through on all of these opportunities. I'm like, great, then my win-loss analysis is going to find nothing with the 62% of bids that we get no feedback on. That should be no problem then.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Paul. Speaking of heads full of gray hair, Jason, how did you vote? You're on mute.
No, I'm kidding. I voted for assumptions of my knowledge of the market.
Okay.
Based on my original answer, which was clearly the second most popular one.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah. And back, so before we get everybody else's take, the one that scored the best was assumptions about the organization's abilities, 41%. I did vote for that, but therefore, even though I'm not interested anymore in winning every poll, I did win this week. So that's a good thing to know. Brian Weber.
The market.
And you want to expand on that, or just
no,
what Jason said? The Charlotte contingency is coming in very unified.
What Jason said, tied to my first answer, the biggest thing I struggle with, jumping to assumptions too quickly when you haven't talked to enough people.
All right. Well, if now that all of a sudden there's a geographic bent to it, I'm going to stay in Carolina and move to Cory. Cory, you said very interesting, and you're torn.
Yeah, so I loved all these answers. It was one of the more challenging things for me to think through. The status in the organization, I never feel comfortable or solid in my status in the organization, so I don't worry about that because I'm always at a whim. The market, I never know enough. I can always learn more, so I didn't pick that one. The leadership, the capabilities of the organization, I've been in places where they could have done more, but they were not allowed to. And I've been in places where they couldn't do the bare minimums. It took them 6 months to get a release out because of all the whatever they had to do. But I have failed when leadership was not honest or could not clearly explain what they were trying to do. And how many times does that happen? They tell you something's important when really what they're trying to do is get an exit in 3 years. And they just want you to deliver as many things and get as many customers so that they can pump up the numbers and get out. That's all they want, but they won't tell you that because they don't want to, because they don't want to scare everybody. So, that's one situation I've been in. I've seen a couple times, but there's others that the leadership just does not want to be honest or open or transparent about what they're really after.
I get that.
Or you touch on a nerve there. I remember going to my CEO because I was a CPO, and I said, if you just tell me what your exit strategy is, it'll make my life so much easier, and I can help you with your exit. No, we don't want, it's like, okay, then I'm going to keep moving forward as if we're going to stay with this company forever,
Well, but see, I've seen that at the smaller companies I've been at, but I've also been at GE and big companies, and you can't assume an exit. So I guess part of it is understanding where you are and what that may be. I'm going to shift from the Carolinas to the Great Lakes region, and we're going to start with Faith. Faith, you're in Chicago, right? You're on mute. You said most fatal to the effectiveness of the product management function in mine as a product manager. You said the company.
But having heard all the other comments, I really find myself agreeing with John that these issues about what the rest of the company wants out of the product management function, or me as a product manager, and I think that is that continuum of alignment, and that makes sense to me to see those things as a cluster that's interrelated. Mm-hmm. I think the one thing that I'm thinking about as people are talking is particularly Cory's remarks that if leadership isn't clear about what they're trying to accomplish as a company or as a business, and in my case, I work mostly in small companies. So I'm not singling anyone out, but it's pretty hard to align or create a product strategy when executive leadership, I guess maybe the assumption is that they should want what I think they should want. And so, things will come out and they sort of don't make sense, and they don't seem really well supported in any kind of way. Like, well, okay, we want to sell to this kind of customer, or we think this particular competitor is one of our key competitors. And I look at it and I think, like, why do you think you can succeed in that segment? Why do you think that's a company that we're competing with in any meaningful way? And nobody can really say. There's just, well, okay, that's just what we're doing. And I would say it makes it very hard for me to feel like I can align myself with that direction, because I don't get why they're saying that that's the direction, and they won't say why they think that's the direction. And I'm not confident that they actually know why they think that's the direction.
So are like
a whole constellation of stuff there.
So all of a sudden, Cory's argument for what leadership thinks is gaining some momentum. I might even want to change my thing there. Glenn, staying in the Chicagoland.
I'm kind of torn between the assumptions of my status in the organization and the assumptions of what leadership thinks.
Which are probably interrelated.
They are interrelated, very, very much so. You could only press them so much. Like Faith is just, give an example of. But yeah, if I could split my vote, I would split it. But right now, I'm leaning towards the assumptions of what leadership thinks.
Again, that one's gaining momentum. May, moving to the eastern part of the Great Lakes.
I was kind of teetering about organization's abilities and my knowledge of market. I think a year ago, I would have gone with my organization's abilities. Over the past, say, 6 months, we've been going through a massive not reorg, but like a restructuring of how we do product at my current company. And I think it's actually really important for us to make assumptions that our counterparts can do their job properly, especially if you are at a functional company.
That's all you can't control that though, right? That's hard.
Exactly. You can't control it, but you like, if you take the time to get to know what their limitations are, if you have the capacity, maybe like influence how they do things. But if you don't acknowledge it, but you still have to make assumptions about what they can and cannot do. At the end of the day, you have to set expectations for, this is what I expect you to do, right? On our behalf. So I don't think that's actually within our control. I think it's really important to accept that this is an assumption that we have to make, right? And also proceed cautiously around it. Maybe write out that assumption, state it blatantly, say, hey, traditionally this has been a problem, so let's make sure we acknowledge it as we do this major feature or this major launch or whatever it is. I think knowledge of the market is always something that comes to bite us, because, even though some things were true the last time you researched it, it doesn't stay true forever. So that is a truth that becomes an assumption over time. So I think we should also acknowledge that as well.
There was a theme. I had said it into response to Jason's answer on the Monday question. It's like, it's not just that we know the knowledge, it's the assumption that it doesn't change, right? And everything changes as we do that. Nils Davis, I didn't mean to go east to west when it started, but we're now all the way in the Pacific time zone in the Golden Gate.
Nobody.
You're assuming he's at the Golden Gate Bridge.
Nobody in
That's
the
his
Rockies
room
or anything.
No.
It's that's my view out my window. So because living in Silicon Valley is awesome. Well, it is, but very few people have that view. So I voted for other, but it probably my actual comment was probably assumptions about the organization's abilities, because I mentioned the sales and marketing. I think that one of the reasons this is on point for me is that back in the Accept 360 days, that was one of our big problems, is that we had a good tool that we didn't know how to sell, because we didn't know how to articulate the value, and we didn't know all these things that later on, that's why I decided to learn something about product management after having been doing it for 15 years. because I wanted to figure out how to not have that happen again. So that was fatal at this particular company. I mean, there were other issues. The executives also thought we were doing something other than what we were doing, or some of the executives did. But then in relation to May's comment about, sometimes the organization can't do the things, or doesn't know how to do, or doesn't naturally do the things that you need them to do. Sometimes you can't make them change, but sometimes you can give them guidance, or, that's where our power to lead by influence is really important, is to say, sales, for example, if sales doesn't naturally know how to sell the thing that I want, that I'm making, I need to tell them, I need to persuade them that my approach is better and stuff like that. So there are some things ways you can mitigate things. And, and that even reaches up to the executive level. If the executives are not behaving right, the only thing we can do is try to influence them to behave better. It might not work, but that's meant to be one of our superpowers, is this ability to influence people that don't work for us.
No, so, I love that. I love the concept of superpowers. Let's move on. I think we're going to have time for one question. And with the panel as big as we are today, what I did want to sort of, I may not get to everybody on this question. It depends on how much time Steve takes talking about a story or ranting about something. In a role largely dependent on assumptions, how can we get better at making them? And I'm going to start with you, Steve.
Oh, I think I'm going to steal John's answer. For every assumption, there's a test. For every assumption, there's validation. And I've joked in the past about making decisions because I talked to a guy. And yet maybe that was the perfect person to talk to, but it's not statistically significant until you do an experiment.
I love that. John,
so John's agreeing with me. Everybody else is wrong. Session over.
John, is that your sole answer, or is that just a part of it?
No, I think that pretty well covers it, right? Like, it's kind of what I said earlier, just being proactive about identifying them, and then, like Steve said, making sure that you have a test for them to either validate or invalidate, so you can make better decisions ongoing.
All right. So maybe my forewarning wasn't needed. If we've got alignment of John and Steve, who else is going to disagree? Well, I will, but I'm going to give some other people a chance before I do.
So the only thing I would say beyond testing them is say them out loud. I'm assuming that we're going to do this, or I'm assuming that this is important, or I'm assuming that this person cares, or whatever you're going to test it, but be honest about the fact that you are assuming something, and
acknowledge
be okay
it as
with
an
that.
assumption. Acknowledge it's an assumption. Don't just state it as a fact.
Right.
I would add there could be a level of prioritization you add to it, almost like your backlog of prioritized features, right? Like there could be a level of prioritization. In the chat, I mentioned like one-way versus two-way door decisions. And if there's two-way door decisions where you can easily come back from it, then there's probably less risk involved, where maybe the level of testing you put forth around those assumptions aren't as rigorous as a one-way door decision, where if you make this decision, it's really hard or expensive to come back from this. And in those type of decisions, you probably need a lot more rigor around testing those assumptions.
This is becoming the Cory, John, and Steve show.
I'm sorry. I just something John just said that's how I'll refer to this from now on. Is it's your backlog is a backlog of assumptions. Thank you for that.
Awesome.
Actually, it really is. In Brian Weber, somehow you ended up next to me, and I was looking and I saw you, so I wanted to go to you next.
I'd say ask better questions. Dig deeper into those assumptions. What do they really mean to you? How important are they? Is it an assumption you can get away with not validating it and move forward? I think it was May before that. There's some you just know you're assuming and you move forward with that assumption.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Paul.
So I'm going to cheat a little and steal answers from a bunch of different people.
That's not cheating. It's called yes and. Yes and.
Well, it's actually just taking Jason's comment in the chat about liking product managers from outside of the industry, and Cory's comment from a couple of weeks ago about how do you learn about stuff, try a bunch of things, and being able to have the different experiences to be able to find the parallels, find the patterns, realize things that apply almost universally, even if they're not commercial topics in general, to have enough perspective to be able to say, does this realistically just match the natural way that things work?
So wait, you're taking us back to our product sense conversation a few weeks ago, where establishing product sense through trying and learning and adjusting and making better, that's product sense and assumptions almost go hand in hand, huh?
Yeah, all you need is full knowledge of everything, and your assumptions are a lot better.
Well, Jason, he stole your answer. Do you want to add anything more to it?
Well, I'm actually looking into the question a little more, because what we've been talking about is how to, I guess, use the assumptions you've made to validate them. But I would say, I'll look at the questions like, how can we be better at making assumptions? Yeah. Right? I mean, we're assuming you're coming in with assumptions, but what about making assumptions? So if I had a new product manager, I would say, listen, let's make some assumptions here. And like I said, if they're coming up outside the industry, how are they going to even get to the point where they are making assumptions? And so we go into sessions that we had before, where it has to be curious, be journalistic, really want to have a desire to learn, desire to get and talk to people, and really learn about the business and those kind of things, where then you can extrapolate from that information some of the assumptions when you get, say, back to the office. And then from there, we can start validating the assumptions and testing the assumptions and those kinds of things. So that's kind of where I would stand on that.
It's interesting. I did some work, 2 decades ago, with a company that trains Gartner Group analysts to be 0.8 confident. Literally, they did training sessions with Gartner because if anybody
instead of 1.9 confident,
yeah,
200% confident.
Yeah, but if you think about that, every Gartner, or at least it used to be when I used to read Gartner, always had a 0.8 probability, right? And they were actually taught them how to get to 0.8 by looking at different things and coming and factoring them. But there's something like that with assumptions. If we can teach people, through experience, through analogs, you could probably even create some assumptions. For me, assumptions always start with an anchor, right? If there's no anchor for your assumption to base it off of, then it's a problem. My answer is going to be along this line. It's going to be a retrospective, right? Okay, here's what we learned. Here's the assumptions we made. Here's what we found out. What do we learn about that? And sort of, always continually sharpening the saw with that. We're got a little time. I don't know if I have time for everybody else to answer this question. For those who have not answered this question, I'd like to give you guys the floor. Anybody want to step in? Nils, May, Glenn, Faith, Brian?
I'd like to just build on kind of what Jason was saying, and touch on the 0.8 thing too. Way back in the day, I worked at Xerox, and we actually had a physical stamp you would put on, reports and tables and stuff that said roughly right. And and the idea was, we don't have all the data in yet, but this is probably like in the 80% or better mode, and you would just stamp roughly right on them. And so
I actually love that, because it's the good enough versus perfect.
Yeah. I love the idea of where Jason was kind of heading, that I don't know that we can actually make better assumptions, but a lot of what we're talking about is the sifting and winnowing, like separating out the second and third order effects and focusing on, the first order effects, the things that actually really, drive your decision, and the things that you can safely ignore. So getting wise about what is safe to ignore seems important. And, a lot of these other things are about kind of mitigating the effect, just the human propensity to make assumptions. It's kind of just the way our brain works. You have to make assumptions about the world. It's probably a strong evolutionary adaptation. So mitigating the effects are just knowing that's how humans work, and figuring out how to not make it have a negative impact on the things we're trying to do. So thanks, Jason, for the couple of those analogies. Loved it.
I love it. And God, Faith, between last week and this week, you're just coming strong. You're killing it. Nils, I was going to go to you next, and I'll go to May.
Yeah, quick thought. Mine's kind of a meta thing, which is to assume that my assumption.
Meta as in the company that now owns Facebook, or meta as in?
Assume that your assumptions aren't good. I mean, basically, I don't know if this is just because I'm wrong a lot, but I just always am checking, am I wrong about this? And I mean, I try to be. Obviously, there's our cognitive and biases prevent us from asking that as much as we should. But my feeling is that I often feel really strongly about something, and that makes me not trust that feeling. That's why I've trained myself, or I've learned by experience that that's the safe place. And sometimes I'm right, and sometimes I'm super wrong, and I need to rethink a lot of stuff, and that's just what I've learned.
That reminds me of nowadays, whenever somebody agrees with me, I wonder whether I must be wrong.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, and I was going to go with that, Nils. I've had people working for me who I thought their assumptions were better than they thought they were. And sometimes it's building confidence in people to have trust in their assumptions, right? And we need to do that. May, you're going to be the last one before we go to lightning round.
That was actually my point. Everything you know is an assumption. Because even if you've just tested it, that test is also based on other assumptions, which is your test is accurate, your test is appropriate.
Statistical sample that you did it right and all that type of stuff.
Exactly. And also your source is correct or whatever, right? Even if everyone in your company has the same idea, that might not be true anymore, or it might not be true, period. So I think the best way to go back to your question of making it possible to validate or just like know what your assumptions are is that when you go and do user interviews and when you go talk to the customer, you leave room for them to explore areas that you weren't going to go in the first place, so they can talk about things that validate the things you already know.
I love that. This conversation has been great. We're going to go to our lightning round, and with the time we have left and with the amount of people we have on the panel this week, we really probably do need to keep it to a word or short phrase. And I'm going to start with Brian Weber. What is the impact when you stop making fatal assumptions?
You stop making fatal assumptions?
Yeah, what happens when you stop making fatal assumptions?
Success.
All right. See, gave it to you first. You can come and start really fast. Glenn Pride.
I got to follow Brian on that one. You get better outcomes.
Success, better outcomes. We're just going to be doing a thesaurus here, I think. Faith.
The peace of mind that comes from responding to reality rather than acting out of the reality I've constructed out of my assumptions.
Oh, God, Faith, you just took my answer, peace of mind. I thought that was awesome. All right.
It's a big enough answer for us both, Grant. We can share it.
All right. Paul.
I'm going to say credibility.
Ooh, I like that.
Good one.
May.
The reliability of the product team, or the image of the product team. You get a much better image in the organization.
Image of the product team. That's another good one. Cory.
You learn and have the opportunity to improve.
Oh, I like that. So, wow, I like that. All right. John.
Yeah, it's kind of piggybacking off of Cory's, but it's a higher batting average, right? It's like
higher batting average. Steve.
You live to fight another day.
Live to fight another day. I like that one too. And actually, I'm going to be pretty quick with mine. I'm going to say that it reduces your stress, right? And this is, we talk about stress and ambiguity and mental everything. And I know I'm making it a thunder answer now, but if we stop making fatal assumptions, we reduce the stress load we have, which is so critical for us. So what a great conversation today. Wow. What a great panel. John Fontenot, thank you for writing the book. Steve, I can't read is this what you're showing?
Yes.
Never
Available
assume.
also on Kindle.
What a great premise and conversation, and wow, everybody came with great takes, and in a profession that is so based on assumptions, I think this is a conversation we need to have more often. And we do this every week. On Monday, we put a question into the community on Wednesday. Normally we do the poll, and on Friday we have these amazing conversations with an incredible panel. And every week I learn, and every week I change my opinions, and every week I say this. And so May, Glenn, Faith, Brian, Paul, Jason, Cory, John, Steve, and Nils, who had to leave early. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you guys next week in the community. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.